Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Stephen, so great to have you here. Before we get started, just wanted to welcome all of our listeners and our viewers today that are tuning in to hang out with Cove's Data Protections chat. Last time we got together, I had my friend Eric Harless with us, and we were talking about disaster recovery and some of the types of DR that we are facing today. We leaned into many different types of solutions and how to recover from them responsibly. Today, I want to bring some awareness and attention and have a conversation about the communication strategy. And I couldn't think of a better person in our organization to have this conversation than you, Stephen, leading our communications and strategy here at Enable. I felt this might be near and dear to your heart.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. That's
You bet.
a big part of what I do here for Enable. So, I hope I can speak to it a little bit.
Well, why don't you give me a little bit, not just me, but our friends that
Yeah,
are joining us today, a little bit about what you do and who you are at Enable.
absolutely. So as you said, I have a strategic communications manager. So I oversee a few different things. One being our strategic organic content. So that's going to include all of our social media, working with our social media team, and then also our Now That's It podcast that we have. So I produce
Mhm.
that alongside Chris Massey, who's our host. And then it's also on the crisis communications ends of things. So I work very closely with our security, our support, our engineering teams, and our partner success teams to help orchestrate with our communications for our partners when there are issues that we need to communicate. And then obviously a lot of it is training and preparing for as Dave McKinnon, our CISO, likes to frequently say, the when, not if an incident occurs. So participating in our tabletop exercises and building the documentations and the resources for that when an incident occurs.
That's where we want to spend some time together for sure, right? I mean, the marketing stuff is fun, but like this is where it really matters,
Right.
right? I mean, our managed service providers that we serve today, they probably have some sort of, maybe napkin strategy. Maybe they have a full-blown strategy or all stops in between. And this conversation today is just sort of highlight some of the things that we should be thinking about. And I think, when we think about crisis, that's huge on everyone's mind about a variety of different things, crypto attacks and
Yeah.
absolute hyper global meltdowns in environments which are taking shape periodically, and how do we respond. And so this is important to kind of create, even at a high level, like just have some steps to a strategy. And I wanted to pick your brain. You've got some really interesting experience and some, prior to joining us at Enable, some things that probably will be really relevant to some of our friends that are listening today. Take us through some of that.
Yeah, so my background. So I started out as a journalist. I have a journalism degree, and I did local news, and that obviously gets you introduced to the on the fly sort of decision making and the quick decision making, which becomes really important in a crisis. And you also appreciate a plan and practicing
Mhm.
that plan in that industry. And then I went into local government, and that really built a really strong foundation for crisis response for me. So I am trained and certified up through the federal level here in the United States with FEMA in the incident response structure. And so what that is at Enable, we follow a very similar structure. After the government, I left and went to a hospital during the pandemic. So again, more crisis experience there, but they also follow a very similar structure, and following that structured response, which is the key to it. The key to it is that you have a role in the incident response. And that may not necessarily be your role every day in the organization, but it's your role in that incident. And others know that that's your role, and you know that that's your role. And that allows you to kind of check off the appropriate boxes, put things through the appropriate chain of commands, and things like that. So having that experience in my past and responding to several crises in that framework allows me to fit right in and kind of fill the appropriate role and know what others are also going to be doing based upon their role, even though I may not have a huge day-to-day interaction with them.
Yeah, I suppose in many office organizations, we have sort of a health and safety organization where we have a crisis committee, and if there's some sort of disaster locally, a fire, a flood, or anything, we have someone responding to that, or a health issues. We know who's going to respond and how, and we can learn a lot from that in our IT world, in our managed server space, right? Where we want to communicate effectively who's got roles and responsibility. They may not necessarily be, the system engineer might not be working on systems. He may be working on something else from a recovery or management standpoint. So that's important to think about too. So if we were to, or if you were to be asked today, let's ask the question together. What are some of the the headlines that we need to be considering when we're carving out our plan for the very first time. Do you have any tips or wisdom that you can highlight for us?
Yeah. So first thing that you might want to have, I mean, in the plan almost is one of the foundations is going to be the communication, the line of communication. What's that game of telephone that you're going to play,
Yeah.
and who are those people? And then in addition to that, like if you need additional resources later, who do you call, who do you contact, and how do you contact them? Hugely important, because one of the first steps in an incident that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to notify the right people. And I think it's important to notify them even before you may need an action from them.
Right.
So that could be legal, is one of the first ones that comes to mind. It could be the support team. It could be the monitoring team on social. It could be the email team, just to say, hey, later today, not yet, but I'm going to have an ask for you that you drop everything and do what I need. And that's a lot easier to say, I'm going to need you to drop everything in 3 hours or in the next 6 hours or in the next hour than it is to say right now. And so that kind of goes across the board. So knowing and getting down that almost checklist of who to contact is one of the first and most important things to do.
Right. And thinking about managed service partners today, they've served so many different customers, and they have to be so literate and fluid with different types of businesses. Um, do you think this is a set it and forget it type creation? I mean, this seems very custom.
Well, I think that you have to have, I think it's best to have somewhat of a high level understanding and have some roles and responsibilities broken out and know that every situation is going to be fluid. And that's where like exercises and practicing it comes into line. Cause again, these are probably not going to be they might not be your everyday roles. It's our marketing team that does emails does not send out like crisis, they don't turn around emails in an hour. That's not what they're used to doing. But sometimes we need to ask them to do that, right? And so they need to be aware that they need to do that every now and then. You need to practice that you need to do that, but there's going to be intricacies to each one being a little bit more nuanced.
Yep.
Um, so in that regard, I think it's like you set and for you review quarterly, maybe every 6 months, maybe depending on how your turnover and organization feels. But you want to touch on those roles every now and then.
So DR testing, is kind of aligned with that communication strategy, right? If we're going to test some servers or workstations for DR, we should probably test our communication plan, especially the very first few steps. I mean, we've already highlighted that, create an order of operations, as it were, of who's going to be called first and in what sequence, and is it a phone call or an email? And then, connect that to our DR testing that we're doing, periodically, whatever that might be, because everyone's got different rules, right? Maybe monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever that might be. What other things, once we have the communication and we've made the initial communication, are there any things that we should be thinking about, or did you experience in some of your past experiences that happen next? What some of those things that we should be thinking about? Insurance, maybe, liability.
Yeah, so legal is always going to be one of the first calls. So that might be, where they come, and that they're going to influence your communicate what you put out for those reasons you just brought up, which is liability and things like that. I'm sure insurance is part of it. That's probably a little less in the communications ends of things. For communications, the big one's going to be monitoring.
Hmm.
So again, in terms of the preparedness, make sure you know where to go to listen. If you've had an issue or an incident and you haven't communicated yet, like you probably even want to do this if you have the time in the beginning. But then it also immediately and onward is get into that monitoring. What are the Reddit threads? What are the Facebook groups? If you got to know that now, and you got to
Oh,
be able
that's a
to
good
go
point.
there and listen. And we have a team that does that. So again, walk through what our situation is. I have a tool that helps do a lot of that. That's also very helpful. But we have a tool that listens in the public spaces that it can. And then we have a community team that, again, this is not their day to day, but I will hit them up and say, hey, just want to make you guys aware. This is what happened. This is the holding statement we have or we don't have, and the action that you should take should somebody talk about it, and let me know. And then they go and they pay extra attention to those communities where people are talking, Slacks and the Reddit threads and that's one of your biggest ongoing. And then you're always in contact with the rest of the recovery effort, right? And so and the mitigation effort. So in terms of legal, in terms of compliance and others, they may require you to make communications, and you're working with that team to execute that.
Right. And so this is really something that our MSP friends today, it's their team. they're going to design this. They're going to understand their communication. The owner or the leaders that have these relationships with their business partners are likely going to be the first persons to call, that empathetic call to say, hey, we're working on this. We know you got a situation. There's some very understanding stuff there. This insurance and legal piece is starting to really crop up a little bit more, and I think it's something that we're probably going to have to include in our communication plan, especially if it's a crypto attack or some sort of nefarious work, right? A drive failure and an absolute meltdown. That's not an insurance issue. That's just that we got to repair something and we're going to be down. And I think communications now, it feels more important to some of these events that are happening, every day now. Everybody's getting it targeted for, I've got your data. It's going to be 100,000 in Bitcoin or else.
Right.
And how do we communicate that to our partners after maybe the MSPs have said a million times over, you need to buy this security or else you're at risk, and suddenly it's not, or they said, I don't need this. It's in the cloud. It's safe. We hear these things all the time. And effectively communicating kind of goes into that now too, doesn't it? It's not just about the strategy once a disaster, it's communicating the warnings in advance too.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of transparency. So I think, you have to, it's talking about things you want to make a decision about a little bit ahead of time, is you want to have a culture of either like, we are very scripted and we are very strict, and this is what we put out, and we keep it in these guidelines, and we're almost like very legal led is going to usually be that way. And that's okay. That's your tone. Or we're more transparent. And you have to have that transparency, that decision, and you can rest on those laurels when it comes to time to be transparent and say to your partners, this is what's really going on to a certain degree. But I would say, again, this is where, as much as communications needs to lead, you are also following that chain of command that comes back to what I was talking about in the beginning about that structure, right? So when you go into that structure, you have to have the right people making the decisions about who, are you going to pay? Are you going to tell? Are you going to, what are we going to talk about in terms of, it's a ransomware attack, or we're not going to say that word, or we're not going to use the word, hack or breach, or, it gets really particular. And so having that chain of command and that organizational structure, make sure that nothing goes out without first going through the communications person, then going through the incident commander, which is usually going to be your CEO, your chief security officer, somebody. But again, it's not always your CEO, right? Like, it's oftentimes your chief security officer in an incident, and nobody says anything, right? It's unless it goes through PIO, communications, and incident command. That's it. And so that allows, so you can't, it makes it a lot easier to not screw up the landmine that is legal and insurance and all that today.
Well, it sounds like, and we would agree today, because that's what we're going to do, is that a good, strong communication strategy pre and post crisis is key to securing a long-term business relationship or just a partnership with any of the people that you're working with today. I think relationships fail because of communication.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely. I'll give a little plug to a podcast episode. Now That's It. Stories of MSP Success. A couple episodes ago, we talked with Dave McKinnon, our chief security officer, and he talks a lot about it. And, pizza and beer go a long way, because when shit hits the fan, you gotta know each other. It's good to meet people before this incident occurs. Also to let them know that you're not always as intense as maybe you are during an incident, and then if you ask for favors during an incident, you want someone you can get that relationship with, and that they'll pick up the phone at 1:00 in the morning if you're calling, if that's what it is, or whatever it might be. So yes, it starts at a relationship. But the other thing Dave also says all the time is, he quotes is it the Mike Tyson quote or whatever it is, the famous quote, like, everybody has a plan, or Eisenhower, whoever, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, sort of deal. And that's it. Like, you can say, I'm confident I would experience a real crisis and the pit in the stomach and the fog, that your head can go into, and not having that plan and not having those documents and not having those roles lined up. It's huge, because you're not, this statement, this sounds obvious. I don't need this written down. This is a no-brainer. You'd be surprised what your head's like in a crisis.
Absolutely. I think that's in that moment when that statement comes out of your mouth is the exact moment when you should probably change course and just jot, even if it's on the back of a napkin, start somewhere. Just
Yeah.
get some thoughts down and think about all the people and places and things that we're going to have to deal with in a disaster,
Yeah.
and how we're going to communicate that is kind of key to how you're going to survive.
Right, and save other people's stuff. If
Yeah.
you, as an MSP customer, if some of us vendors that you work with or other partners you work with communicate well or poorly, but in an issue or incident or something that you like, save it.
Absolutely. Is that save is the big word, in Cove data protection, we are protecting data. We're saving data for these crises, right? It's so, part of the world I live in the landscape that I see is I'm going to get your data back. It's okay. We're going to be okay. I know there's other things that need to be taken care of. And I've been on calls and part of groups and teams where we've, strategized and pulled that data back, and it's all been a group effort, and we've got the customer back to where they wanted to be. But that communication was vital to making sure that everyone felt safe, everyone felt protected, and they felt heard, and that they felt that they were being taken care of.
Yep.
And so that's huge. And I saw that firsthand. And it changes the way people respond to you in a crisis if you're communicating well.
There is no bigger. I truly believe in any negative or positive moment in anybody's life or history. I promise you, in 99.9% of them, you can find communication as like a pivotal, either better or worse thing. It's huge.
That's amazing. So we're not going to solve all of the world's communications issues in this moment. What we wanted to do today was just introduce some things to be thinking about if you hadn't been thinking about it. Maybe something's in your blind spot, and maybe this conversation helped uh, reimagine how you might be dealing with something today. And if you have some questions, you can always contact us here. Steven's at Enable, I'm at Enable as well. And we love talking about these types of topics to help our partner network create their own unique experience for themselves. Steven, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. We don't get a lot of time often in these conversations, and I'm glad we got right to the meat of this one. I think it's important. It's a conversation that we'll continue to have, and we look forward to spending some time with you all to help. Steven, any final words as we go?
Make sure you have a plan. Even
Absolutely.
if it's small, make sure you got something.
That's amazing. Well, everyone, thanks for hanging out with us today. Really appreciate your time. If any of this was useful, do let us know, and we'll gladly get on a conversation or get on a call to extend that conversation.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.